record here. And I think we are good. So on to our current presenter. Father Columba Stewart hardly needs an introduction. I will try to keep it brief. As you know, he is a scholar of early Christian monasticism, among other things, and has produced a long list of important publications therein. Father Columba took over the Hill Museum and Manuscript Library here in Minnesota in 2003, I believe, and he has done an enormous amount of work finding and preserving manuscripts on an international scale. Just a few years ago, Father Columba received the Guggenheim Fellowship for his work on the project he'll be presenting today. And in 2019, last year, Father Columba's work received the highest honors as he was asked to deliver the 2019 Jefferson Lecture to the National Endowment for the Humanities. And now he joins us today to share his work with us on the origins of Christian monasticism. So without further ado, welcome, thank you.
Thank you. Great to see all of you in the weird way that we've become used to seeing each other these days, and good to see some friends from Washington here as well. Everybody hear me okay? The volume is good. Of course, you can't nod your heads because none of you have your cameras on. All right, there we go. That's it. You've learned all the tricks of Zoom. So my goal today, and I am speaking to you from Himmel, by the way. This is not a virtual background. This is actually my office at Himmel. And it's been good to be back in the office a little bit more recently. My goal today is to introduce you to some of the broad lines of a project I've been engaged in for some time, which is on its way to being a book to be published by Oxford University Press. And this is a kind of fresh look at the origins of Christian monasticism, emphasizing certain aspects of the background that I think have been underemphasized, covering a lot of familiar ground, but perhaps looking at it in unfamiliar ways. And so today I want to give you sort of a broad idea of what I'm up to in this project, and then go into some of the fundamental aspects of the background of Christian monasticism and the formation of what we might term the early Christian ascetical tradition. And depending on time and interest, we could wander into the Syriac world, but we may have enough to talk about without even going there. And the reason why this sort of development of early Christian asceticism and its background and then Syriac Christianity are connected will become clear right off the bat in what I have to say today. So with that introduction, I'm going to switch over to share my screen and show you a presentation. So let's get that queued up here. All right, so we're going to share that one. And then someone's going to tell me if you see only one slide. You see only one slide?
I see the origins of Christian monasticism revisited, one slide.
Excellent, that's what we want. I'm convinced that Zoom doesn't update every time I try to share my screen and changes the way you choose the screen to actually share when you're doing a PowerPoint or Keynote. So let's get into the broad overview of the project. Many of you know the traditional view of the origins of Christian monasticism is that it was an Egyptian phenomenon, obviously coming out of Christianity and its antecedents, but appearing in a kind of ascetical big bang associated particularly in the traditional model with the figure of Antony the Great, the Egyptian peasant, born a Christian, who then has a series of divine revelations which lead him to go off into the desert and to begin a way of life which proves to be immensely attractive. Now, everybody who's in the seminar today knows that that's not how it actually happened, and that a more accurate view of the origins of Christian monasticism and, of course, Christian asceticism is multiple centers where it emerged in different ways, not unconnected because it grew from the same soil, but there's always a certain kind of local flavor to that soil, which led to the development of distinctive ascetic cultures. So what I want to do today is talk about some of those common elements. And then, as I mentioned, should we have time, we could wander a little bit into Mesopotamia just to see what something may have looked like there. The whole goal of this is essentially to dethrone the traditional model which is received in the canonical tradition. And this is the sort of the way the story was told until fairly recently. And this is certainly the family tree that I was given when I became a Benedictine monk in 1981. So you have this Egyptian element, and then you have the anchoritic solitary element, then you have the communal or cenobitic element. And it's a direct genealogy into which I, as a novice, could insert myself, as you see at the bottom of the chart there. So, you know, it's like a classic literary stemma or manuscript stemma. And as we've all learned to realize when working with those texts or those manuscripts, often that schematic presentation of information is largely fictitious, even if the fiction is written for constructive or edifying purposes. And this certainly proves to be the case with the traditional model. So the reality that we've all become much more aware of in the last, well, we could say 100 years, really less than 100 years for the full picture, but beginning in the late 19th, early 20th century with the recovery of certain early ascetic traditions and their manuscripts, largely as a result of colonial plunder of the Middle East, and then the exploration of these manuscripts by people in London or people in Rome or people in Paris or people in Berlin. And these texts have begun to reveal to us this much broader and richer story. And here you see the traditional model, and then on top of it are all these new things that we've learned about, which sort of fill out the picture, both in terms of things which were non-canonical in the sense that they were deemed heretical or aberrant in the early Christian tradition, as well as things which were, from a traditional Christian perspective, perfectly orthodox, but sort of fell off the screen because of a preference for particular ascetic models and their associated literature. And a great example of that is the Rule of Benedict, which of course is by no means the only Western monastic rule. It was certainly part of many, many rules at its time, and there were rules written after it, but for various reasons, it becomes perceived as the sole Western monastic rule in the tradition. So the result of all of this was some forgetting, and examples of this would be the early Syriac tradition by later Syriac tradition, which is particularly interesting, that very rich historic Christian cultures forget about their own origins. And this is particularly the case in the Syriac tradition. And the short story for how that happened was basically Syriac Christianity got swamped by Egyptian monasticism and its literature, forgetting its own pre-monastic ascetic tradition. There were also urban ascetic women living in what you might call Christian philosophical communities, just as men did at this time, who for various reasons were written out of the literary tradition as they were replaced with female monasticism along the sort of approved, canonical, highly regulated lines that we're familiar with from the 4th century on. And then also these post-Benedict Latin monastic rules, and losing the fact that Benedict's rule competed. And not only did it become the norm because of a particular imperial intervention in the Carolingian era, but it also proved its worth as eminently balanced, not too long, not too short, and able to serve a variety of monastic cultures. There were also aspects of the story which were neglected. Jewish asceticism, which basically vanished from awareness for reasons both internal to Judaism and also related to the catastrophe that befell Jewish Palestine in the 1st and 2nd centuries. The presence of ascetics in Egypt before Antony, even though Antony, in the life itself, Athanasius's life, it describes Antony as learning his ascetic practice from old men who lived on the edge of villages, leading the life which was to become his. And then a great example of the very narrow Western perspective, and that would be the fact that Egyptian monasticism from the 5th century on is really dominated by the figure of Shenouta of Atripe. And if you read the classic introduction to Christian monasticism, Derwish Chitty's The Desert a City, which it was a kind of standard work read by many of us, published, 60s, early 60s, somewhere in there. He never even mentioned Shenouta. And it's as if the Christian monastic golden era simply ends, sometime in the late 4th, early 5th centuries, and neglects the fact that it continued and flourished, partly because even in Egypt, this particular monastic tradition itself was largely forgotten, again, for a variety of reasons, including the terrible intellectual degradation of Coptic monasticism because of persecution, and then the recovery within the Coptic world of its own history, which happened in the 20th century. And then you have all the interesting things that were condemned. And so often they survive only in mention in anti-heretical texts or snide asides in the sort of mainstream Christian literature that continued to be copied and propagated. And so you get groups like the Marcionites, the Encratites, I'll say something about them. And then of course the Manichaeans, who are one of my favorites recently. And I don't know if we'll get to the Manichaeans today, but we can certainly talk about them if you would like. Extraordinary. You get other things like male-female ascetic cohabitation, the practice known as synesactism, which drove bishops absolutely nuts because of its potential for scandal and misunderstanding. And I will say more about that today. There are also different theological traditions which were suppressed, not entirely, but were officially condemned and suppressed, such as the Origenist and Evagrian traditions of speculative theology, and the way that, in a sense, at least Origen continued to nourish the Christian world, even if driven underground, and Evagrius continued to nourish the Christian monastic world, even though his writings were put under the names of others. And then you get the classic instance from the Rule of Benedict, chapter 1, of the Cerebites and Gyrovagues, the detestable and then even more detestable forms of monastic life, which Benedict sees as the kind of antitype of the Anchorites and the Cenobites. And of course, they wouldn't be mentioned if they didn't exist, just as in canonical literature in the early Christian world, they don't condemn something unless there's something to condemn, even if we find it extremely difficult at this distance to recover exactly what that might have been. And I think what we're seeing with Cerebites and Gyrovagues are examples of forms of Western monasticism outside what was the approved norm. So that's my big picture overview. I hope that's making sense. And then what I'd like to do now is just talk a little bit about the philosophical background, then the Jewish background, then how this unfolds in early Christianity, to take us up to the point of the emergence of the first literature figures that we think of as representing that classical monastic genealogy that I shared at the beginning. And what I'm sharing with you here on these slides are just sort of bullet points taken from my actual working draft of the first part of this book. And I have that working draft in front of me. And so I'll be pulling kind of topic sentences and themes out of that. So you're really getting, a kind of first hearing, I guess, of some of the things that I hope will be published before the eschaton. So let's talk a little bit about the philosophical background. So the first point that we have to remind people of, and you remind your students of this, those of you who are teaching, and it's something that we always have to remember, is that neither the Jewish traditions that we know nor the Christian traditions that we know emerged completely independently, as if they were, created ex nihilo, or if their inspired writings sort of descended free of cultural and intellectual influence or contamination, as some might view it, from their surrounding cultures. And this is particularly the case in the late antique world, before and then during the early Christian period, in terms of the ubiquity of Hellenistic philosophy. And the fact that the love for wisdom was a concept which permeated both philosophy and the Hellenistic Judaism of the period, as well as early Christianity. And the simple reason for this is twofold. One is the reminder offered by Pierre Hadot and others that in the ancient world, philosophy really functioned in the way that we think religion functions. In other words, as Hadot noted, in the ancient world, to philosophize is to choose a school, convert to its way of life, accept its dogmas. And as he added in other places in his writings, to practice its spiritual exercises, many of which become extremely important for early Christianity. And then the sort of second thing to recall is the ubiquity of the Greek language, which becomes the lingua franca throughout the Mediterranean world. And therefore, its conceptual vocabulary, of course, is used by anybody who's writing in Greek, whatever their particular philosophical or religious tradition might be. And this is especially the case of Hellenistic Judaism at this time, where Greek was the language of the majority of Jews in this period. And of course, the most commonly read version of the Bible among Jews at that time was the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, the Septuagint. And that, of course, is the basis then for early Christian writings which find their way into the biblical canon, those writings we think of as forming the so-called New Testament, as well as other Christian literature, were based on that Greek translation. We'll look in a minute about at the issue of what happened to that Hellenistic Jewish tradition, but it's an important point. The other thing that is also crucial to our story for both what we think of as Jews and Christians in this era, and I recognize all the complications of using those terms and the debates about the actual parting of the ways and so on. We can talk about that in the discussion if you want. So for simplicity's sake, I'm just going to speak rather conventionally of Jews and Christians in these remarks. The other key development is what's happening within this broader Hellenistic philosophical world itself. As from the first century before the Common Era, we see a kind of shift in the center of philosophical reflection from the dominant Stoicism, and of course, none of these traditions are pure. To call it Stoicism doesn't mean it's the same as taught by this person or that person or is found in this writing. These are broad terms, obviously, to a kind of synthetic Middle Platonism, which is much more hospitable to understandings of a kind of creating God, to a monotheistic perspective, which then allows it to be used fruitfully by Hellenistic Jews, and then of course by early Christians, and then its later development of Neoplatonism, tremendously important for Christian mysticism as we move into the later part of the late antique period and beyond. And of course, given the fact, as Hadot notes, that philosophy really was understood as a way of life, functioning as a total discipline. The basic terminology that we tend to use in talking about Christian asceticism is largely taken from that philosophical vocabulary. And this would be, of course, terms like asceticism itself, ascesis, which was used to describe the intensive study or associated practices which were necessary to follow a philosophy. And that term, like much of the early philosophical vocabulary, was borrowed from athletic training. And of course, the link between athletic training and philosophical training in the ancient world was much stronger and evident than it is today. Another term common in this literature, very important for later Christian literature, is the very term enkrasia or enkrateia. Sophrosune. I mean, these are all things which you turn up again and again and again in the early Christian ascetical literature. And of course, they come from philosophy. Practices like melete, the meditation of authoritative texts. So the memorization of philosophical dicta, or later of biblical literature like the Psalms or the Book of Proverbs. And then the continual meditation, by which they mean the actual recitation and pondering of these texts, very typical of early Christian asceticism, and very much so of monasticism, as indeed we still do, both in our common liturgy when we gather several times a day in our Abbey Church right here at St. John's to pray the Psalms together, and in our individual Lectio Divina, the Benedictine form of this practice. And then, of course, classic maxims, there it is, know thyself, know thesaurton, which turns up in the book of Deuteronomy. So these are all things which are both traditional wisdom, Egyptian roots, Mesopotamian roots, and Greek philosophy, which begin to show up even in literature we think of as Jewish or Christian, Hebrew Bible, and also the Greek writings, which are in the Septuagint, which together form that Greek version of a Jewish Bible, and then certainly in Christian literature. And the evidence of Hellenism and philosophy is manifestly evident in the biblical wisdom tradition, particularly in its later stages. And we'll see an example of that in just a moment from the Book of Wisdom, which was actually a Jewish writing composed in Greek in the early 1st century of the Common Era, and survives in Catholic and Eastern Orthodox Bibles, but of course did not make the cut for understandings of what composed the Hebrew Bible, because it wasn't even written in Hebrew. So with that sort of basic philosophical background, I'd like to go in a little more directly to the Jewish background, and particularly the importance of both Hellenistic Judaism and the apocalyptic Jewish traditions that were around at the time of Jesus and the birth of the Christian movement, which were so incredibly influential then for the kind of ascetic cast that Christianity has right from its origins. And the argument I want to make is, it isn't that Christianity came up with something new with asceticism. It's that in a way, Christianity perpetuated a tradition within the Jewish world of its time, which then later disappeared, at least manifestly in its original form, within Judaism, although elements of it reemerge in later mystical traditions. And that we really need to engage with that, what the Jewish world was like at the time of Jesus, to fully appreciate what we're dealing with. So I'm just going to put some dates up on the screen so you have them, and just to sort of remind us of key formative elements of the kind of political world of that time, and then the religious impacts from some of those political developments. And obviously the key points for this story are what I have indicated in blue, which is the controversies emerging in the 2nd century before the Common Era among Jews in Palestine over the tendencies of Hellenizing rulers, and then the fracturing of Jews into different communities based on how they responded to that Hellenizing influence. And this gives us some of the groups that are actually named in the Christian Gospels, like the Sadducees and the Pharisees. And then the group that surprisingly, or perhaps not surprisingly, is never, ever, ever mentioned, which is the Essenes. And I'll say more about that shortly. And then the other note in blue, of course, is the First Jewish-Roman War, the destruction of the temple, a total cataclysm and catastrophe for Palestinian Jews. And of course, this is happening at a key moment in the development of early Christianity. And then finally, the completion of that devastation in the 2nd century, in the Second Jewish-Roman War, and the utter banning of Jews from Jerusalem, not just destruction of the temple, but the recreation of Jerusalem as the Roman city of Aelia Capitolina. So with that, forgive the whirlwind nature of this, but we will be able to talk about this shortly. With that, I want to talk a little more about these particular aspects of what I was just describing that are relevant for us. And one is the reminder that if you're going to look at the major constituents of what we think of or might describe today from this distance as Judaism at this time, it's more accurately described as Mediterranean rather than Palestinian. And this is because of the various diaspora and Jews active throughout the Mediterranean world in stable communities, working in Greek in their personal and professional lives, and then reading the Bible in Greek in the Septuagint. Therefore, their reliance on a Greek rather than a Hebrew Bible, and the circulation of texts, as I've noted, which are not part of today's Hebrew Bible, but have survived either in canonical Christian collections of writings or were quite popular in early Christianity, even if they then didn't make the cut for various reasons, as the collection of writings considered acceptable by an imperial Christian church as that became clearer. So it's actually interesting that looking at a modern Catholic or Eastern Orthodox Bible today brings you a little closer to the array of authoritative religious writings that Jews in this period would have been familiar with. And many of those writings are really important for understanding the milieu in which teachers such as John the Baptist and Jesus could arise. Now, of course, another point to emphasize here, well, before I go on to that, here's just this example of what I'm talking about in the Book of Wisdom. Written in Greek, a Jewish work, beloved of Christians, very important later for a lot of Christian imagery in liturgical texts, as we remember just before Christmas every year in the so-called O antiphons of our liturgy, which are based on images from the Book of Wisdom and then the prophet Isaiah. So here you have this, as part of this beautiful ode to wisdom in the Book of Wisdom. Wisdom, of course, personified as a woman. Wisdom's labors are virtues, and she teaches self-control and prudence, justice, and courage. So here you have Platonic and Aristotelian virtues, which have become totally mainstream in this religious context, just as we find ourselves today in modern religious communities, quite naturally using psychological terminology when we talk about religious practice or issues in religious community life, because that is simply the argot we have today to talk about the sorts of issues that in the ancient world were talked about using philosophical vocabulary. Now, it's important also to note that until the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and then the recovery through odd pathways, such as Ethiopian manuscripts, recovering aspects of apocalyptic apocalyptic Judaism, we really had little fully credible evidence for the existence of Jewish ascetic groups at the time of John the Baptist and Jesus. There were descriptions of the Essenes in non-biblical literature, notably by Josephus and Philo, but also by Pliny the Elder. But there were always questions hanging over the reliability of Josephus. Philo was a bit of a romantic author. It was very difficult to imagine that those were actually definable groups that could be recovered. And this changed dramatically, of course, as a result of the recovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, which we'll touch on a bit later. And then, of course, you have the dramatic reconfiguration of Palestinian Judaism after the destruction of the temple. And this seems to be the time when the various parties described not only in the Christian Gospels, but in the writings of people like Josephus and Philo, when they seem to disappear for various reasons. So the Essenes vanish or get reconfigured. The Pharisees continue in some form in the rabbinic Judaism we think of as forming the mainstream tradition later. Sadducees, so tied to the priestly establishment, of course, for the destruction of the temple and its economy, that changes dramatically. So the key point for us as we move into then themes important for early Christianity are found in the writings left by what for convenience can be called apocalyptic Judaism. And this is literature arising in this period just before the Common Era, just after it, literature which is a response to crisis. And we have evidence of this even in Christian biblical writings today in certain chapters of the book of Daniel, added in the 2nd century before the Common Era, the highly apocalyptic, bizarre chapters which are all about raving beasts with multiple heads and horns and eyes, and how these represent enemies which arise and then can be defeated by some sort of divine agency. There's also the enormous range of what we sort of unbeautifully describe as pseudepigraphal literature. So writings which are attributed to biblical figures or associated with biblical figures, which again come out of this effort to devise a religious response and to provide consolation and hope to communities which feel besieged by foreign influence, which is then exacerbated by the Roman takeover of Palestine and this very intense political oppression which happens in that era. And then associated with this also would be the Enochic literature, abundantly found in the Dead Sea Scrolls, almost completely disappeared from modern awareness, both among Jews and Christians, until its recovery in the 19th century by way of first Western encounter with Ethiopic Christianity, in which the literature of the Enochic tradition played a central role and remained part of their canon in a way it did not elsewhere in the Christian world. And as I note here on the slide, many of these were in these early Christian collections of biblical books, even if they were pushed out at some point, though remaining in Ethiopian tradition. Now this tradition, and this is very evident in things like that little book, that little element of the book of Daniel, which you won't find in sort of non-Catholic, non-Eastern Orthodox Bibles, and certainly in the Enochic tradition, would be a very complex cosmology. And this kind of cosmology is quite typical of what is sometimes called intertestamental literature. In other words, those writings composed between the kind of classic Hebrew Bible and the Christian writings, where you have this whole development of angels and demons, this whole world which permeates the miracles of Jesus, much early Christian and monastic writing, and then a strong emphasis on sinfulness, repentance, purification or cleansing as a way to deal with the intrusion of the foreign element into the religious body of the Jews. Related to that, an emphasis on an ultimate reckoning, a judgment of the dead, a place of punishment, and all of this accompanied, all of these elements, the ultimate reckoning, the judgment of the dead, the descent into hell, accompanied by heavenly portents, signs in the sky, signs that can be interpreted by those who understand their meaning as indications of this end time. And this is taking us right into some of the elements of the teaching of Jesus as it's presented in the Christian Gospels, and then obviously in things like the book of Revelation, the letter of Jude, which actually quotes First Enoch, one of the Enochian texts, First and Second Peter in the New Testament, which also very influenced by this tradition. And then elements of the Gospel of Luke. Luke has a particular emphasis on wealth, poverty, and justice. And this is seen as something traceable to the same tradition, where the rich are often identified with the oppressors because they are perceived to have profited from all of those things which are attacking the fundamental religious values. So with that, I think we can turn to the scrolls and how they have helped us recontextualize and reimagine groups like the Essenes, and then giving us a closer or better understanding of what somebody like John the Baptist or Jesus might represent. So you all know about the Dead Sea Scrolls. There's Cave 4, one of the most important caves. It had most of the scrolls in it. You all know the drama of the many fragments of the scrolls, the decades-long scholarly tug of war over access to them. But of course, the key point for us is not that drama. It's simply the existence of all of these non-biblical texts from the Dead Sea Scrolls, which are showing us this whole tradition, this whole form of Jewish life, which essentially disappeared. And the interesting fact that much of it was actually written in Hebrew, rather than being simply viewed some of this period as Greek influence on Jewish thought, that there was living, continuous Hebrew literary composition, not simply the common spoken language of Aramaic or Greek, and that much of this is evident in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And of that, 75% of the scrolls, which is non-biblical, 40% of those writings are what you might call sectarian, referring to the actual identity and life of communities. And I'll call them plural to avoid the automatic assumption that the site adjacent to where the scrolls were found, the site we know is Kirvet Qumran or Qumran, was an Essene settlement, which was the place where the Dead Sea Scrolls were written. It's clear that the story is much more complex than that, whatever Qumran may have been. If it was the location of a particular sectarian Jewish community, it was one of many. Perhaps Essene, perhaps not, but within the same kind of broad tradition. And among those texts, of course, of great interest to those of us who are looking at the origins of Christian asceticism as a way to get at the origins of Christian monasticism, are texts like the Community Rule and a somewhat similar text known as the Damascus Document or Covenant of Damascus. Multiple copies found among the scrolls. The Damascus Document also found in the Cairo Geniza, the recovered early manuscripts there. And this is describing the life of a particular community. So the Yahad, or the community, that's simply what it means. which is all about a great teacher who is revered as the source of true teaching about fidelity to the law, about how the community maintains its very strong identity and separatist identity for the sake of preserving the purity of its observance of the law, and all sorts of interesting things about how you let people into the community, how you expel people who violate its practices, strong emphasis on ritual purity and a particularly stringent form. And then interesting insights that link it out to other texts found among the scrolls about the use of a solar calendar and other things which mark it off from the sort of conventional mainstream Jerusalem practice of the era. And all of this is saying, wow, people like John the Baptist or Jesus were not oddballs, they were not innovators, they were perhaps even fairly typical examples of what was happening in Palestinian Judaism in their time. Which leads me then to say something about the Essenes, and then I'll turn to the early Christian trajectory, and then I'm going to stop talking for the sake of our discussion. So when we talk about the Essenes, until the discovery of the scrolls and the clues they provided to people like the Essenes, even though they don't actually use the term itself is of mysterious origins. It's very convenient because it is used by these early sort of historiographers. Pliny the Elder, interesting because he's not a Jew, although he's the one without firsthand knowledge of the people he's describing. Philo of Alexandria, of course, beloved by early Christian writers in that Alexandrian tradition because they saw him as a kindred spirit, using philosophical tools of biblical interpretation to understand the Septuagint, just in the way that early Christians of that same tradition used allegorical interpretation to make the Septuagint readable for Christians. And then the very controversial Titus Flavius Josephus, known by his Latin name, who wrote in Greek, who was a very prominent Jewish military figure and aristocrat who went over to the Roman side and then spent his retirement writing with a sort of twofold literary agenda. One was justifying his own behavior because he had committed, of course, a great act of treason. And the other trying to show the Romans how important Jews actually were, that they were an ancient and venerable religion, that they had elements which could compete with the philosophies of the day. And because of Josephus's personal apologetic agenda, of course, and some of the divergences between his different accounts of the same topic, he's had some suspicion cast over his reliability, but scholars like Stephen Mason today have, I think, helped us recover the fact that Josephus has a lot of stuff we gotta rely on. As Philo and Josephus tell the story, the Essenes grow out of the priestly party in opposition to the current temple regime. And just as we find in things like the community rule from the Dead Sea Scrolls, they are described as having a very strong group identity, a very ascetic lifestyle with an emphasis on ritual purity, strict dietary practices, and also in both Philo's and Josephus's account, a strong emphasis on the celibate practice of the Essenes. Although it is unclear in their accounts if this is talking about a kind of permanent celibacy, or if this is a celibate practice by young men before marriage and then by older men after they have raised a family. So if they then become kind of opportunistic celibates, as it were, for the sake of closer dedication to this particular form of practice. And these accounts are really fascinating because particularly Josephus and Philo to a certain extent, although less obviously, situates the Essenes as one of several parties. And so it's helpful to read Josephus to understand what Pharisees and Sadducees might actually have represented, even though their appearance in the Christian Gospels is really there as foils for the teaching of Jesus. And therefore, we can't really look to those for accurate historical understandings of who they were. But in these texts of Josephus and Philo, they really do emerge as an obviously ascetic group, which could give us sort of pointers toward how early Christians might have continued aspects of that tradition in the way that they chose to live. And then, of course, Philo also gives us his fascinating account of the so-called Therapeutai, the philosophical group living outside of Alexandria, which he presents as the contemplative counterpart to the more active Essenes. And Philo's account of the Therapeutai in his treatise on the contemplative life has long been regarded as a pure fiction. It's too beautiful to be true. It's so highly stylized. I think we might write it off just a little bit too quickly, despite all the problems it has in its particular details. And before we turn to the early Christian period, I just want to leave one more thing about Josephus. And that's the way he describes his own particular journey. He says that as a young man, and this probably was a typical kind of search at his time, just as it is, today in so many ways. He said he checked out every one of these groups. He checked out the Pharisees, the Sadducees, he checked out the Essenes. He's trying to find what you might describe as a philosophy within his own tradition that would be something he could practice. And he does not end up joining those groups that he describes, but it gives us some sense that perhaps we can give his account of them a little more credence than we might like to think. One of the things he describes from that early experimentation is time he spent living by the Jordan with a Jewish ascetic whom he calls Banus, who seemed to delight in frequent ritual bathing in the cold water of the River Jordan, dietary practices, living in animal skins, and things like this. And he said that Banus was living by the Jordan and practicing these things for the sake of purity. And given Josephus's chronology as a young man, he would have met this figure, say, 2 decades after the death of John the Baptist. So whereas John the Baptist in the Christian Gospels appears as a startling, dramatic figure at the outset to kind of set the tone that this is something really new and different, when you view John the Baptist in the context of Josephus's Banus, it begins to look rather different. So I'm going to say a little bit about early Christianity, and then, as I promised, I will stop talking and we can talk a bit, and then decide where we want to go, if at all, beyond what I've been saying. So, early Christian asceticism. Okay, the first thing we have to recognize, as we recognize already in dealing with Palestinian Judaism and the Hellenistic Judaism, which was so influential upon it, and also at times its antagonist, is the problem of sources. And I've always known in my research that we have so little from the early centuries of Christianity, and you can push that back before the appearance of Jesus in the Christian movement. What has become clear to me as I've engaged in this particular project more deeply is the writing out some of those traditions I showed in my expanded family tree at the beginning of my comments today, as well as the fact that even texts that we now think of today as quite authoritative in the Christian tradition, things like the writings of the apologists in the 2nd century, or the Stromatites by Clement of Alexandria, very important theological work. These things survive in 1 or 2 manuscripts. They did not continue to be copied in the Christian world because they went out of date. They were no longer relevant. And so, although they have been, in a sense, rediscovered in modern Christian scholarship and seized upon by people writing the history of Christian theology, and particularly by those who are sort of operating within the tradition, the classic Christian patrologists, writing about the so-called fathers of the church, the early Christian writers venerated by the tradition. They were working with texts which barely survived and only accidentally survived. And so we have this tremendous paucity of evidence. And as some of you may have heard me say in different contexts, we scholars often seize upon one of these texts and we construct upon evidence, say the size of a dime, a skyscraper of scholarship. And then somebody finds a quarter, right? And then we realize that we had taken such a narrow view and we have to keep adding to it the evidence we find, which is, plug for Himmel, why we have to go looking for manuscripts, because things survive in unexpected ways and unexpected places. All right, so that's the sort of caution and prologue. So obviously, I've already done a little bit to comment on locating John the Baptist and Jesus in the Jewish world of the early 1st century, the Common Era. When we then deal with properly Christian literature, so we have the Gospels, which people tend to think of reflexively as really important early sources, forgetting that the Gospels in the form that we have them today attain that literary form after the letters of Paul. So that's really the Pauline literature that gives us our earliest peek into Christianity. But that as we look at those writings, particularly the Christian Gospels, there's a good deal of ambiguity in them about Jesus's own attitude toward what we might describe as asceticism or ascetic practices. There is the strong tradition, and I think it's actually likely, that Jesus was unmarried and celibate. There are people who've said, well, you can't use the lack of evidence to argue for the fact that it was this. But I think given what we see in description of the Essenes and these other holy figures, it's certainly possible. It's not the utter sign of contradiction that it might be if you're thinking solely in terms of later rabbinic Judaism and its strong emphasis on the life of the family and marriage as basically essential for faithful following of the tradition. But of course, his actual teachings are quite ambiguous. And what there is in his teaching, when he mentions fasting, dispossession, and when he mentions things like in Matthew 19, those who make themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of God, these have been seized upon by later Christians as justifications for practice. But nonetheless, we can draw lines, dotted lines, between what we see in some of that Jewish literature and what we see echoed in the canonical Gospels, with their obviously not verbatim preservation of Jesus's teaching, but enough consistency among them that there is a core tradition of Jesus's teaching received by these various Christian communities and then adapted to their own particular interests. And then the idealization of early Christianity presented in the Acts of the Apostles, composed by the same author as the Gospel of Luke, composed after the destruction of the temple without ever mentioning the destruction of the temple, and prominently featuring Paul, but never mentioning the death of Paul, the execution of Paul, as the tradition has received it. So clearly identifying or describing an idealized, burgeoning movement, which takes its inspiration from the idealized community in Jerusalem of Acts chapter 2 and chapter 4, which are all about common practice of prayer, the breaking of the bread, presumably a reference to the Eucharist, and the sharing of goods. So sounding not unlike practice among the Essenes and other groups, which had their teachings, their forms of prayer, their ritual meals, and their pooling of goods and common ownership and reliance on the group for support. So what's really more important in a way for recovering the history, as opposed to recovering texts which were later used by Christian ascetics or Christian monastic groups as a biblical basis for their life and practice, is tracing things through the letters of Paul, then the next stage of the Pauline tradition, the letters written under Paul's name but not by him, First and Second Timothy, the letter to Titus, other letters in the New Testament canon and beyond it, and the glimpses we find in them of both an ascetic component to Christian practice, as well as the tensions arising because of asceticism, and the kind of shadows falling across those writings, which are preserved in the Christian biblical canon, of syncretism, dualism, this condemnation of marriage, as opposed to an approval of virginity at the same time as there is approval of marriage as the typical Christian path. And of course, the shadows which fall across that literature are very evident in some of the later literature retrospectively condemning precisely the teaching of people like Marcion, of Tatian, and others who represent that kind of nascent dualistic strain in Christianity. And as scholars have noted, one of the key aspects of early Christian practice was early Christian development was precisely sorting out these issues around ascetic practice, and particularly sexuality, and figuring out a way that a certain ascetic tendency could be preserved and honored, while at the same time not making what would in fact be a fatal mistake for the survival of a community, insisting that all members renounce marriage and practice celibacy, because you can have a group doing that, but that's no way to grow your church, if you want to think of it in marketing terms. And then what you find in this literature, as it develops, emerging very strongly in the mid-2nd century apologists like Justin and Athenagoras, is seizing upon the Christian practice of virginity and celibacy as a marker of Christianity in the late antique world, and as a sign or particularly privileged expression of Christian sexual morality. And this is evident very, very early. People like Justin Martyr, so he dies around 165, I think, and he talks about the fact that he has known people now in their 70s who have been virgins since birth. So this kind of purposeful celibacy, which obviously was there early on. And then of course, there's the famous discussion in First Corinthians chapter 7 by Paul of whether one should remain unmarried or not, given the imminent arrival of the kingdom. Another text which has been very influential for later Christian asceticism, even with all of the problems of interpreting it, within Paul's own context, and then the way that it was later used. So as you move out of the writings that form our New Testament today, that kind of canonical group of writings, as you move toward the apologists, and even before them, other letters, such as the first letter of Clement and other things which were included in some early Christian Bibles and not others, they all touch on this particular trait. So this idea of sexual asceticism is there right from the start. And obviously it's coming in there, not only as a Christian response to a kind of imminent eschatological event, but continuing the notion in Judaism as a response to a presumably imminent eschatological event. And this just grows and grows and grows, even as you have the rise of these groups, which are viewed as threatening because of their overemphasis on this aspect of Christian life and practice. And then the last thing I want to talk about is the emphasis on virginity that you find emerging very strongly on the basis of those elements of Christian practice that are signaled by the text I've just described, that emerge very strongly from the late 2nd century into the 3rd and 4th in the various writings which are exalting virginity. And this is virginity, which has a strong emphasis on female virginity, but it's easy to forget that many of these writings are also addressing male virgins. So we don't want to retroject sort of later understandings of Christian virginity as a female thing, and men might be celibates, but you didn't use that kind of terminology because that is a very gender constructive understanding of what virginity means, obviously, overemphasizing physical intactness as it was understood to apply to women and not to apply to men. So I think it's important to recover the mention in these treatises of the fact that men were doing this too, even if the female practice of virginity could attract to it all sorts of biblical imagery less applicable to men, such as the Song of Solomon, the parable about the wise virgins and the teaching of Jesus, and so on. So one of the texts to highlight in this development is the famous story of Paul and Thecla. And I'm sure most of you have probably read it. It's a great story. It's a romantic story about Paul's faithful disciple Thecla, a young woman who's engaged to be married, who happens to overhear Paul teaching when he visits her own town, and becomes utterly inflamed by what she hears, and then decides that she will follow Paul and that she will preach like Paul, overcoming the opposition of her mother, the disappointment of her fiance, the judgment of Roman officials who want to condemn her for her Christian practice and her unwillingness to follow conventional stereotypes. And you find in the Acts of Paul and Thecla, this marvelous, I don't mean marvelous in the sense that I recommend this for your practice. I mean marvelous in the sense of it's really interesting, version of the Beatitudes that Paul teaches, playing off of the conventional ones in Matthew chapter 5. So for example, blessed are those who keep the flesh undefiled, for they shall be a temple of God. Blessed are the abstinent, the inquates, for God will speak to them. Blessed are those who renounce this world, for they shall be pleasing to God. Blessed are those who have wives, as if they did not have them, for they shall inherit God. Blessed are the bodies of the virgins, for those bodies shall be pleasing to God, and they shall not lose the reward of their chastity. Now, this becomes an enormously popular text, and Thecla becomes a virginal archetype of immense power in the Christian imagination. And this is true to this day. When you visit places like the Shrine to Thecla and the town of Sednaya, north of Damascus. But that Thecla text, with its emphasis on a woman who goes off and does these things, who becomes a preacher, a teacher, a woman who even, according to the text, baptizes herself rather than receiving baptism from the hand of the apostle. There are also these treatises that emerge in the 3rd and 4th century, which are addressed both to men and to women. And I've been working on these quite recently, and it's fascinating to compare the distinctive emphases of each one of these with respect to the other treatises, as well as the common themes to be found in them. And once you get into these things, they are really interesting. And they begin with the so-called Clementine letters on virginity, which are addressed to male virgins, and which seem to reflect a kind of time and place where you had male celibates traveling as visiting preachers or prophets, much like you find in other literature emanating from a kind of Syrian context, and telling them how to behave when they're out there in the world, to the more kind of conventional treatises on virginity, such as that of Basil of Ancyra, with its heavy emphasis on the medical aspects of diet and virginity, and also texts which are less well known, such as a homily, an anonymous homily attributed to Basil, which in the scholarly literature kind of bizarrely is known simply by the title of the French article, which brought it to scholarly attention, Une curieuse homélie grecque. We got to come up with a better name to describe this thing. So when you read these texts side by side, and this is where I will lead into my final comment about ascetic cohabitation, you realize there was a market for this. There obviously were young Christians, male and female, who wanted to do this. There were bishops who encouraged them. There was the growing development of liturgical rites, particularly for women, to mark their commitment to the life of virginity. And these treatises often contain advice for how to deal with your parents who oppose this, because they want you still to be a player in the marriage market, as well as encouragement to parents directly on how they should make sure that their children behave, and the duty of the parent to respect their commitment to the life of virginity or celibacy. And it's against this background, and I'll say final point here, that you find this growing ecclesiastical interest in the practice of ascetic cohabitation. The treatises on virginity that I've just described, apart from the so-called Clementine letters on virginity, all imagine the practice of virginity occurring within the family home. So the daughter or son remains in the family home, and that's the safe space for the practice of this way of life with prayer, sexual renunciation, and so on. But the question soon arose, what about those who don't have the option to do that? Parental opposition, they come from a background of poverty, they've gone to a different place, and thus the appearance of the practice of male and female ascetics living together as brother and sister, or as they sometimes self-describe it, in spiritual marriage, where they are forming a household for the sake of convenience, mutual support, and friendship, but not a conventional marriage with its sexual dimension. And as you would imagine, this drove bishops insane, and there's a welter of ecclesiastical canonical condemnation of this practice across the early Christian world, the late antique world, beginning in the 3rd century, continuing in the 4th, and remaining in canonical collections rather, even as everything I've described so far is swamped by the emergence of the monastic paradigm. And I can say more about that in our discussion. And I will stop sharing screen now and welcome your comments. So are you still there?
Yes, we are here.
Okay.
Thank you, first of all. That was fantastic. You can see your little applause signs popping up